All right, so this will be the last lecture for this course on the historical books. We've talked about Joshua and Judges. Now we're going to focus in on the book of Ruth, the last of the three of the historical books that we're covering in this course. We're just going to spend one lecture on this book, not because it's any less important than the other two. In some ways, especially how it's been used in the history of tradition and used within church history, it may be a little more important, as in you may be more familiar with the book of Ruth and its story than with Joshua and Judges. However, it is shorter, so that's why, because of the nature of this course, we have given more time to the books that have more content in them, at least as when it comes to the number of passages that are written or the number of chapters, and less content to those that have less chapters. So the book of Ruth only has 4 chapters in it compared to Joshua and Judges that have many, many more. So we're going to dive into that. Just know that your final exam is coming up next week. So just make sure that you prepare for that as you complete the assignments for this week as well. And it'll be cumulative for everything that you've learned over the course of this semester. All right, so let's dive into the book of Ruth. So our focus will be just on 2 things related to the book of Ruth and covering sections from Michael S. Moore's commentary on Ruth. And this would be themes in Ruth, just because we want to get a big overview picture of the book. And then we're just going to talk about the concept of levirate marriage in Ruth, specifically how it comes up in Ruth 4:5, the last chapter of Ruth, and kind of the controversy that causes in Ruth scholarship. We're going to dive into that now. All right, so one of the books I like to use, especially when I'm teaching interpreting the Old Testament on the master's level, is this book by Richard S. Hess called The Old Testament, A Historical, Theological, and Critical Introduction. And even though it's for master's level research, he still has some good pointers to make about the theology or the purpose behind the book of Ruth. So I'm going to go into his 3 purposes, which really is only 2, as I'll explain here in a moment. So first he's going to say it gives us righteous models to emulate. So you have Ruth being the main righteous model to emulate, which women flock to a lot for a variety of reasons. But then you also have Boaz being a male masculine model to emulate. And I would argue you also have Naomi. You have, really those 3, I guess, to be fair. But then that leads into David himself, who becomes the greatest king that ancient Israel ever had, as far as who ruled over them in righteousness and truth, a man after God's own heart. And one of the things Hess is going to argue that the book of Ruth is trying to do is that you have these righteous models that you can emulate, and this ties into the line of David, and this is resembling the line of Seth, or the righteous line that's brought up in Genesis chapter 5. So just like in Genesis chapter 5, where you have 10 generations, and it goes from God to Adam down to Noah, he's going to argue that you have the same sort of thing happening here with the line of David, that you go through 10 generations, and it's intentionally designed to kind of model that. So ultimately he's going to make the point that you have these righteous models to emulate, though he's going to divide it between the righteous models themselves and then specifically the line of David. From there, one of the other main emphasis that is found in the book of Ruth is just that Gentiles who follow God's law are actually a part of the people of God. So Ruth was a Gentile who followed God's law and became a part of the people of God. You can find this in other books as well. So you have like Rahab in the book of Joshua, who was a Gentile and became a part of the people of God. And then you have some, in the book of Judges as well, some Gentile people who act righteously. But the emphasis about that is not as strong as in the book of Ruth, because really these 4 chapters are about how this Moabite, Ruth, who should not have been allowed to worship with God's people, became a virtuous woman as described in Proverbs 31. The ideal woman ends up becoming someone who's not even someone related to the tribe of Israel, but someone outside of the tribe of Israel. And she's the only person in the biblical text to get the title of the virtuous woman, like we find in Proverbs 31. So I would argue, at the end of the day, Richard Hess is going to argue there are 2 main emphases for the book of Ruth. The first one being that we should follow these sort of righteous models, and the second being that Gentiles who follow the Lord and keep his law are actually a part of the people of God. So from here, you have Jason Dreschbach, who's going to argue that there are six main themes to the book of Ruth. So he's going to say loyalty, honor, wisdom, blessing, reversal and redemption, and divine and human cooperation. And for him, these six ideas are once again not completely unique to the book of Ruth, but are emphasized more in Ruth than they are in other books themselves. And I wanted to bring this up because it contrasts a lot with what Richard Hess does, and even with what we're going to explore here for Moore's commentary in a second, is that there's different ways to, once again, to look at books. And depending on the lens in which you use to look at them, depends on what you're going to think is the main emphasis. And as we get closer to the end, I'm going to argue that something related to love and marriage is also the main emphasis of the book, more so than some of these other topical themes that people have pointed out. But we'll get to that in a moment. Michael Moore is going to argue that there are three main themes to the book of Ruth, and that you can put these into polarized terms. So he's going to say wanderer and restoration, religion and ethics, chaos and kindness. And we're going to kind of walk through each of these. So starting with the first one, he's going to argue that to be a Hebrew is to be a wanderer. And that is just key from Abraham to Moses to David. He lists all of these on page 300. And then he's going to contrast three wanderers with what's happening in the book of Ruth. So he's going to say, you have this concept of wanderer that reverberates through Judges 17 through Ruth 4. So he's going to say wanderer 1 is in Judges 17:8, where you've got the wanderer situation happening there. And he's going to cite from it and say to wander to whatever place that he may find, where the Levite is just traveling and wandering wherever he's going to be. Then he's going to say wanderer 2 is happening in Judges 19 verse 1. From there, that this husband looking for this new wife in a new life. And then he's going to say wanderer 3 takes place then with the book of Ruth, and that you have those three wanderer stories kind of each being contrasted with each other, and that as you leave the book of Judges and you have this sort of wanderers and the first two not finding what they were looking for, you get in the book of Ruth where the wandering actually leads to the sense of restoration, where Elimelech ends up dying and things are lost, and it's going to be like, he's going to say, unlike Wanderers 1 and 2, however, Wanderer 3 eventually does find his way home, being Naomi finding her way home and then being restored from there. So next he moves into the religion and ethics discussion. In the same sort of thing, he's going to say if you have the wanderer situations at the end of Judges that contrast with the wanderer situation in Ruth that then it gets to restoration, he's going to say if you look at the religion at the end of the book of Judges and the ethics that you find in Ruth, Ruth has good moral ethics. So the religion there, once again, as we've explored in Judges already, is that you're going to have Micah setting up this false shrine. You're going to have the Danites doing all of their sinful behaviors. And the point here being that Moore is trying to get at is that this has all of the right religious elements. So you've got the shrines, you've got the ephod, you've got all of the elements to do a good religious ceremony. You've got sacrifices happening, but you don't actually have any good ethics behind it, compared to when you get to the book of Ruth. There are no sacrifices. There is no religious aspect of it, but you have her living ethically and actually living out the obligations of taking care of one's family and all of the other things that are at the core of this. And this makes me even think of Christ's statement in the New Testament, where he talks about how the Pharisees were worried about all of the elements of the law, but they neglected the quote unquote smaller parts of the law, like taking care of each other and helping the poor. And lastly, Moore is going to deal with the polarization of chaos and kindness. And so he's going to point out just the difference of kindness in both texts, because there's Hebrew synonyms or Hebrew words that are very similar in the Hebrew word hesed and kanan. In Hebrew, these two terms come from the same root that means something like kindness or loyalty to someone else. So he's going to point out here that kindness is used in Judges 21-22 to talk about how the Danites or the Benjaminites needed more daughters, and so they pretty much had to go and take some from Shiloh and pretty much rape those women and force them to be their wives. And when the people protest, the judges say back to them, "Do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them in the war, and you are innocent, since you did not give your daughters to them." So they're saying, do this kindness to us, and we won't hold it against y'all. God, in their opinion, won't hold it against you. We needed to do this. This is a justified means to what we're trying to get out of this chaos. We're trying to bring some closure or some restitution. So the backlash of this is not on you. It's going to help the overall situation. The ends justify the mean in their sense. However, this is not what's happening with kindness in the book of Ruth. So Naomi, views kindness as a gift. Kindness is something rooted in personal character and integrity, is what he's going to point out. So she uses, once again, the word hesed for kindness in Ruth chapter 2, verses 20, where when she hears about Boaz, she says to Ruth, "May he be blessed by Yahweh, who does not abandon his kindness to either the living or the dead." And then going on, she points out just Boaz has the same sort of sense of kindness, where it said about him, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness that Ruth has shown to him is greater than that which you showed earlier." So over and over again, you get the contrast of what real kindness is supposed to be, the sort of gift, the sort of going above oneself to give to another, versus this sort of quote unquote political kindness that's found in the book of Judges, where you just kind of turn your back on what's happened because we're trying to get something accomplished here. So those would be the three sort of themes that Moore points out in his commentary on Ruth. All right, so now let's transition into a conversation about levirate marriage. So in Ruth chapter 4, verse 5, Boaz is going to say, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, to Lahakim Shem Hamet al-Nahalato." And that is a very similar phrase to the same thing that's said about the levirate marriage law in Deuteronomy 25:7, where it says, "And if a man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders and say, 'My husband's brother refuses to,'" and then the same similar phrase in Hebrew, "to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel, Lahakim Lahavav Shem Be Yisrael." So the point being is you have similar statements, and that's why we bring up the idea of levirate marriage in Ruth chapter 4, verse 5. And those are the only two places in the Hebrew Bible where you have such a similar statement. But the problem is everything about the law in Deuteronomy 25:7 is not exactly what we expect to find in Boaz. So maybe I should say that a different way. The way that Boaz actually does the levirate marriage law does not match what is written in Deuteronomy 25:7. So either Boaz is following a different law than what we actually have in Scripture, or he's breaking the law because he's not following the law the way it's supposed to be followed in Scripture, or there's something else going on here entirely. So we'll explore some of that here in a moment. So just to emphasize that a little more, I'm going to read for you a statement here in Dressbach's commentary, which is very similar to what you'll find in other commentaries on the book of Ruth. He's going to say, "This theme is associated by many with levirate marriage. There are enough differences, however, between the events in this scene in Ruth and the levirate laws of the Torah that it cannot be argued that the levirate laws in Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 10, and then this is also done again in Genesis 38, is in view in the book of Ruth." So he's going to say this is not what's happening in the book of Ruth, and you can find similar statements in other commentaries. I just used this one as a sample. So Dedrick Bush, who has the #1 commentary on the book of Esther, and then I think it's like the #3 commentary on the book of Ruth in the Word Biblical Commentary series, is going to make a similar argument, and he's going to kind of push it a little further. He's going to say there's 3 main differences that exist between the levirate marriage laws in the Old Testament and what we find in the book of Ruth. He's going to say Ruth and Naomi appear to have no legal rights, so they're not the ones who take this cause up like it's described in Deuteronomy 25. They're going to say distant relatives appear not to be included. So even though Boaz is a relative, and even though the unnamed kinsman redeemer is also a relative, distant relatives are not actually included in Deuteronomy, so why in the world would they be following this? And then you're going to say the description in Ruth is positive, not negative, regarding levirate marriage, whereas in Deuteronomy 25, the description is completely negative. The woman ends up pretty much accursing the brother who won't follow through and actually let his brother's inheritance continue by actually going in and doing his duty as a brother of the man who died. So the point here being is that there is some sort of unique situation happening here in Ruth, and now we have to somewhat figure out something to deal with this. And so this is a part of a paper that I'm working on. I may have some time to present it at some point this year, but I've not completely finished it. But you can't just dismiss the idea of levirate law or the levirate law in Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 10 not being related to the ideas of what the author of the book of Ruth is trying to get across, because as I'm pointing out here, you have a citation from Deuteronomy 25, and I'll go ahead and highlight this for you. So you have a citation from Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 10 in every chapter. So chapter 1, you've got a citation. You got a reference to the concept of it in chapter 1 as well. Then you have it in chapter 3, chapter 4, multiple times, especially the last part of that chapter, and from there. And when I first did this research, I couldn't find anything in chapter 2, so I don't have that listed on the table here for you, but I just did some research yesterday before I made this recording, and there are also references to this in chapter 2. So the fact that Boaz is a worthy man is contrasted with the unworthy man that's mentioned in Deuteronomy 25:10. So in chapter 2, verse 1, do not go into another field is a very similar Hebrew phrase to do not go to another family in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. So this will be in Esther chapter 2, verse 8. The death of your husband is similar to the statement of the wife of the dead man. So that's in chapter 2, verse 11, and then similar in Deuteronomy 25:5. So the point being is at this point, I've got enough research to demonstrate that in every chapter of the book of Ruth, you have a citation from the levirate law in Deuteronomy 25. So the author has intentionally woven in that structure or those statements into the book of Ruth as he's decided to, or she has decided to tell the story to us. And so that means this is at the core of what is actually getting to the theology of the book in and of itself, not just those other themes that are pointed out by Hess and Dressbach and Michael Moore, though I also think that those are interesting and important. I do think we have to grapple with why is Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 10, this levirate law, so elusive or immersive into the book of Ruth, and how does that help us build out the theology that's intended by the author? I won't solve that for you today, but I just want to highlight that for you. Hopefully I'll have my paper completed soon, and then I can talk about this more. All right, so with all that being said, I will end the discussion here. Once again, this will be your last weekly quiz, and then you'll have the final. Make sure you study for that, and I hope that you have a good Christmas break after you've completed this class. Always feel free to email me and reach out to me if you have any questions, and God bless.